In late September 2024, Hurricane Helene wreaked havoc on Cocke County, Tennessee, and particularly the city of Newport. Historic flooding from the Pigeon and French Broad rivers submerged downtown, damaged critical infrastructure, and forced mass evacuations throughout the county. The storm caused more than $160 million in damage to county facilities alone. In Newport, Tennessee, the City Hall and Police Department were incapacitated, roads were washed out, and power and water services were disrupted. Meanwhile, the Cocke County Jail in Newport suffered severe flooding, leaving behind sediment and mold that forced its closure. Approximately 100 to 150 inmates were relocated to neighboring counties, and county officials are now locked into a difficult debate: repair the old facility or build an entirely new one, a process slowed by funding disagreements with FEMA. 1 year after the flooding, TCI recorded a podcast in Newport, Tennessee, capturing a discussion between Mayor Rob Mathis, Sheriff C.J. and TCI Executive Director Will Wall on the county's continuing challenges stemming from Hurricane Helene.
Mayor Rob Mathis, Sheriff C.J.
I got a promotion.
There you go. Just thank you guys for having me out here. Like I talked to you about earlier and previous, and we share some history with what we're about to talk about. But one of the things that I want to say is like what happened to your community and what happened to your facility, because TCI being involved with jails in the criminal justice system, there hasn't been a situation where you had to evacuate the jail because of some disaster a long time. And the ones that have happened before, we read newspaper articles about it and things like that. In fact, one of them is the reason TCI exists. But so we wanted to make certain that we documented that piece of it and how the jail and the annex, which held the court annex and the mayor's office, basically all your county government infrastructure related to leadership and corrections was just destroyed by Hurricane Helene. And I just want really to talk to you guys about that, not just from where you're at today, but starting off maybe with like the day that it happened. Tell me about that day and what you expected. And either one of you, it doesn't matter who.
Well, we had some form of, communication that, on Wednesday that, there may be something, come, from the Hurricane Helene, and there could be some flooding, obviously not at the caliber that it came. We knew there was going to be a flood. But, prior to the flood, we've always had a plan when it comes to the inmates in the facility, what we're going to do, how we're going to, go through the process. And we've always had a great working relationship with the school system. And we knew, how many inmates we would have. We know how many people you can get on each individual school bus. And we worked that out with obviously the school district, the bus maintenance guys, and talking to their supervisors. So even without a flood, just involving, if the jail caught on fire, we've always had a plan to have these school buses, and the school system is always, it don't matter what time of night, they're available, if we have to have them. And, we already had all that going. We'd already spoke to the rec center. The jail staff had spoke to the rec center. The first plan of evacuation, obviously, is the annex because it's the closest one to be involved in a flood. So we already had it set up, the employees, and already had everything with administration to transfer all the annex exempt women. We were going to move all the male inmates to the Cocke County Rec Center because there is only basically 2 ways in and 2 ways out. So we know we can control that by them taking their mat, their sheets, things like that with them to the rec center. And any, we even allowed them to grab we had enough time where they could even grab their buckets with their commissary or whatever, just to get them satisfied and get them through. So that's the plan. The other plan with the females was we was going to open up the circuit courtroom, which is on the second floor of the courthouse. And we were going to transfer all women into that area. And then obviously that's another way, only 2 ways in, 2 ways out, that's not locked or not maintained all the time when it comes to that. But we had all that planned out, but we didn't actually start, the water started moving much quicker than, what we've been advised. When I started here 25 years ago, you had a certain point, you had certain time frames where, when it got in the parking lot, you had this such time to get evacuation done and all that. So we evacuated the annex, and we were able to start transitioning the inmates to the courthouse and to the rec center. But the water started moving so quickly, it's probably about an hour or 2 hours later, may have been less, we realized the water was fixing to take over the courthouse. So, and then obviously, we'd got information provided to us that the dam had broke. So that, once we heard that, we automatically said, well, we're going to have to evacuate both jails. So once we got all the annex moved and transferred, then we started working on the old jail. And that's when the other counties and sheriffs started reaching out. And, obviously Jefferson County had a workhouse, hadn't been operating in 2 years. So once we started getting into that mess of knowing, okay, there's a lot of water coming, the dam's possibly broke, that's when he reached out, and then Sevier County Sheriff reached out. And I think we sent a little over 40-some inmates to Sevier County, and then we sent the remainder of everything we had. We had 141 or 142 incarcerated at the time of the flood. So we transitioned everybody else to Jefferson County. So, pre-planning is you got to know what you're going to do with them. So we had a plan. Plan got better because somebody had a facility available for us that could hold them. The only thing that affected us was the old jail. We knew that we could house inmates in the courthouse until we could come up with a plan within the next 24 to 48 hours where we're going to start transitioning, start movements across East Tennessee. But, we called everybody in. We had everybody come to work. We'd actually sent out, I think either Wednesday or Thursday, we'd already sent out emails and contacted employees. Everybody's on call. You cannot take off if you're on vacation. If you're not out of the state, you're going to have to be here. So, the plan we had in place was there, and obviously we had to implement that plan because it happened. So I feel like, either way the situation would have went, even if we didn't have the Jefferson County workhouse to go to, we had all East Tennessee sheriffs, TCI, everybody started reaching out saying, what do you need from us? Have you got a plan? What's going on? But, even though we had a plan, between the state and you all and other sheriffs reaching out and even police departments, obviously they don't have correction facilities, but, what can we do? But, if it would have been just transport inmates for us, trying to get them to and from, because we didn't have transportation other than the school buses, so secure transportation we've never had.
It's a challenge.
It's a challenge. And it's an expensive.
Oh, yeah.
And it's an expensive vehicle. But, luckily we was able to reach out to, people like to go to conferences and, well, what do they do at conferences? They just go down there and have a good time. And, but if it hadn't have been, and I'd been to the Sheriff Association conference before, and, Josh and them, and they'd been to the TCI conferences before. But, when you go to these conferences and you go in to see these 100 and 150 vendors, you're like, what's the point? Well, the point is when you get involved, like for my sake, being in part of the Sheriff Association and being part of the Training Officer Association before I got elected, I was able to build great rapport, great relationships with all of these organizations, companies, because once you started building that, then you had to fall back on them to get us through where we're at today.
Yeah. I mean, that's why, some people misunderstand it. It's like, oh, well, you just go meet a bunch of vendors. No, what you're doing is a technology expo, and you never know some things you're looking for. You're looking for maybe a new medical provider, a new food service, or someone who's going to outfit your vehicles or things like that are just everyday. But like transportation vehicles or high-risk transportation vehicles, it's not something you purchase super often.
Right.
However, if you start looking, and I definitely want to talk about this, when you start looking at the rest of the community, how many of those resources came into play when people stranded, up on the mountain, or there was, swift water rescue that maybe I'm sure you reached out to some of those same individuals to have to say, hey, what do you have? And at least I know where to get that. it means more. And I know some people think that it's, you go there and they have a booth and they try to sell you stuff. It's more about protecting your community.
Well, and I mean, vendors, they're even the ones you don't use, or the ones you don't have in place under contract in county government, it didn't matter. The ones that you still didn't have still reached out. It's ankle monitors for inmates that have to go out on work, or out with trustees or things like that. I didn't really put a whole lot into that because all of our inmates are usually with somebody that's armed. But these companies started reaching out, we can do your monitoring for you because we know you're going to have a lot of transportation issues with trustees and work programs and things like that. They reached out to us. They were very beneficial. That's a small thing that you would have never thought of. But you also, you got state law that says, well, you're going to have to do this. So, that was helpful. In a winter expo, in Murfreesboro, you go down there and you see this big transportation van with an insert, and you're like, well, we won't ever have one then. We won't ever need one, but I didn't take his card and throw it in the trash can either. I kept it, and I was going through like 100 cards, and I got to find this guy with this van. So, but we've got a good networking. And I mean, you have to build, not just in East Tennessee, we had sheriffs, police chiefs, TWRA, THP, TBI, FBI, ATF, every single agency, even from out west, Memphis, what do you need? We're sending it to you, and if it was just absolutely amazing, the network that you build whenever you're in part of these organizations. And that's, I'm like, if I hadn't have went the extra mile and hadn't made that trip to Nashville, or I hadn't have made that trip to, Sevier County, Murfreesboro, wherever, I would have never built that relationship with the sheriffs, with the vendors, with TCI, with all state and federal agencies. That's where you build this. And, even going to the Sheriff's Academy, that's where it started. And I know they've not had that for many, many years, but I can say without the Sheriff's Academy, and having the opportunity to go down there and start meeting, CTAS, start meeting TCI, start meeting, the Commissioner of Safety. That's where it begins. And if you don't allow that in, then where would we have been when we had the flood involving not just the jail? And I know this is a lot towards the jail, but I mean, the amount of troopers, TWRA, people that came in that was here as first responders, swift water rescue squads all across the state. I mean, that built a whole relationship to where, we didn't have time to pick the phone up, because at one time the
Knox County Sheriff sent helicopters.
Oh yeah. Yeah. He called and said, what do you need? Do you need our support? And I'm sure we will. But I mean, he sends in 2-3 helicopters. But I mean, if you hadn't had that relationship with him, getting to know him, where would we have been at that? There's so many things that you don't realize that's important, especially in that position, that will you ever need them?
Yeah. And that's the beauty of, of having the new sheriff's school. And it used to be 1 week, and I'm not knocking what the new sheriff's school used to be, but as it transitioned and the way that we've worked together with Post and Toledo, and we've worked with CTAS and TCI, we've all been partners. And next year we have an election, and we'll have that new sheriff's school over a period of 2 weeks. That, like you said, that's the beginning to setting up the network, because if we didn't work with each other, because that's one thing some people assume, that, you got the state and they come in and they police the locals. It's not how it works. We all live in the same communities. We work together. If we don't look at each other as internal, external customers, and that we're all trying to accomplish the same goal, public safety, then we fail. And I think that's what Tennessee does. I get a lot of calls from other states saying, well, how does TCI do what they do? I'm working with a couple of states right now, because the ability for everyone to kind of fly in and centralize some of those things, in this case, where it's like, okay, we'll take this, we've got that, and we all kind of know each other. And we're a vast state. We're 3 different states in one. And the ability to connect everyone and get the things moving. Tennessee's a bit unusual that way, that we're really good about helping each other. I don't call us a volunteer state for nothing, right? However, that's the way we've tried to set up some of, as far as TCI is concerned, because that's what I can speak to. But I recognize that with other state agencies as well that we partner with. Partner with the post, the TSA, CTAS, all in the new sheriff's school. But it doesn't stop there. We still see each other 2 or 3 times a year or work together on many projects. And I think that's great. This is great to hear that, that everyone, even though I kind of knew, but it's just, we're doing a podcast. So, to let people know that
stuff like this happens.
Right. That we're a community of people got together and said, hey, a community of law enforcement, a community of not just law enforcement, but EMA, citizens, you name it.
It does radiate out as you guys are talking. It kind of strikes me that engaging with these associations, the trainings and the conferences, that's a key part of our jobs.
Absolutely.
A key part of what we do. Because when we go and we engage, I mean, just a couple of things that come from that. One is resources. We find out what, it could be vendors, it could be equipment, it could be just technology, whatever that is. You got resources, you have best practices across the state. It could be everything from regulatory updates to, hey, what are you folks doing over there that could help? We can to solve our problem.
What I was going to say is like TCSA and that group where,
yes.
Commissioners and mayors, that's something that we regularly attend to, hey, let the mayors and the county commissioners know, about different legal updates or some things that may be changing, or just to have a Q&A session about.
Sure. And it's that cross-functional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what gets those relations. That's kind of the last piece. But you got like I said, you got the resources, best practice, opportunities such as grants, programs, things of that nature. And lastly, it's the relationships. And I think that may be the most powerful part of it, kind of like what you guys are saying. And something I've said many times since the hurricanes hit is, other people will ask us, what can we do to start preparing right now for something like that? And my answer is always start building relationships, because when disaster strikes, that's not the time to build relationships. It's the time to lean on them. Right. And thankfully, Sheriff Ball, C.J. is great at doing that. I've engaged with doing that over the 2 years that I had spent in the mayor's office leading up to that. And when it came time, those relationships were there in a real way, and they came through for us in a big way.
No, and that's the out of disaster, seeing community come together, but which leads me to my next thing is that, no matter how much everyone can do or is trying to do, there's still obstacles, and we're a year out, a few weeks ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's still things like I was walking past the building, over by the mayor's office side and on the jail, the jail side, and looking at the building where it's pulling away and settling and watching, one of the things I may ask you, Sheriff, if I can go in there and take some video kind of underneath of how that thing's affected eventually, if it's, today or whenever you get an opportunity, just to kind of show what the damage is. And across this community, I know that's been a challenge because the jail's just one thing, but you all have lost so much of your public infrastructure or the challenges you're still dealing with today. So infrastructure-wise in the county, or even resources-wise, like I can't imagine you've dealt with everything up to the point law enforcement-wise, but then you're seeing infrastructure. You're trying to keep your community together. And all this is, not crumbling or collapsing. You saw all this help come, but what happens is I hate to say it, but there's a big push of assistance, and then when it starts to go away, it fades, and then you're still left picking up the pieces. And I'm not knocking anything, because everyone, you got to push.
So much people can do.
Exactly,
yeah.
You got to push resources when you can. But what's been the biggest challenge in your community since that initial push, relative to? Let's talk about infrastructure. I'll stop there. We'll talk about infrastructure. What buildings, county-wise, and even city-wise, were affected or damaged or uninhabitable? I know that the jail annex, a court annex is, mayor's office, the old, because it's in an old hospital.
Go ahead,
It's
Sheriff.
just
Yeah,
uninhabitable.
the annex, you got obviously you got 4-H and you're like agriculture type. You had your Veterans Affairs office, you got your election commission, you got your mayor's office and his staff, you got Chancery Court, which you had a courtroom in Chancery Court. They deal with a lot of civil matters. They deal with child support matters. They deal with a lot of civil dispute matters, divorce case, things like that. That physically shut down an entire court proceeding. Well, laws don't change because bad things happen. So they've got so many days to have their court case. They've got so many things to do that. So Chancery Court is a humongous loss there because of where you got state laws and you got federal statutes, you got Supreme Court rulings. So you had to get them transferred. And luckily luckily there was office space available in the county because, if we hadn't had office space or had places to put your county government infrastructure, where would we be at today? Like Chancery Court has to meet at the Newport Utilities building to hold court. When circuit court or sessions court's not available for them to use those buildings. And then they're separated from their courtroom. That's big. Obviously the jail, everything's transferred out of there. All your county government offices that does all operations, your payroll, your bill payments, accounts payable, all that stuff had to be relocated, and then you got the flood on Friday, but when something major happens, you still have to move forward. You have to have a plan, and get things up and going. The courthouse took water, but it didn't take water where it's built up so high. All it went into the basement, and that, when you start seeing how everybody else is having to respond and react to find places and get things done, when I walk in my office, I'm like, what? It was good to be able to do that because we didn't have to relocate the entire courthouse. I mean, you can always say, what if that would have went down, I don't know where we'd be at today, but you lost the police department, your animal shelter all took water, City Hall went down, all county and city governments basically was completely inaccessible because it was all flooded.
And the city police are still operating out of their community center.
Yeah, they're operating out of the community center, and that's a long-term fix till they can get the process of getting the police department built and getting the animal control building built. And we lost the highway department, all it went underwater.
Roads, we've had 4 roads, significant roads destroyed, not just damaged, but destroyed and countless others damaged.
Yeah, but the brain was completely underwater. So, and that's
tough.
First was saving lives. That was the main thing. Save every life. Get to where you can, first response, do everything you can to get the people to safety. All that other stuff, worrying about county government, worrying about city government. Nobody cared about they was going to get a paycheck on Monday. They could care less about that. Their main objective was get people out, get people home, save lives. That's priority. County government, city government can start back up whenever people's safe. And then obviously it goes back into the portion of where you got to start operating other things. But out of that whole deal, main thing was people safety, rescue. Everything else, we'll worry about it later. And we're here now.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, exactly.
Well, and that said, I have to brag on our staff a little bit here. All the bills were paid, even though our office was destroyed. They found this office quickly. I was still in the emergency operations center. We were still, like the sheriff said, we were still in life saving, and then trying to get food and water to everybody because the water, the power and water were both knocked out for several weeks, and they found this. Everybody worked together and found different places, like the sheriff said, homes for everybody to go. Didn't miss a payroll. All the bills were paid. And one thing, it's important, you mentioned the elections office. The last Friday in September was when the flood hit. The first Tuesday in November was a presidential election. Yeah. And we were able to, even with the early voting, we're still able to do all that without missing a beat. And I want to commend the elections, Josh Blanchard and the election commission for making that happen. everybody really worked together
Them
well.
voting machines was not going down the water. I mean, he was there probably a day or two, may have been Thursday or maybe Friday morning before anything happened. It may have been Thursday. He had removed all election, all the voting machines. He loaded, I think it may have been a U-Haul.
He did. He rented
But he
a U-Haul.
loaded it up and got it out of there.
Because he and I had a conversation earlier that week, and he let us know he's putting them all in U-Hauls, moving them to high ground, and thank goodness he did, because he was able to move them all down here to where he's at, the temporary location where he's at now, and make it happen. You know, still make that election happen. If those, can you imagine if those voting machines had been lost in the flood?
Really.
People who were trying to perform their civic duty and their right to vote in an election would have been diminished, or try to figure that out. I mean, because I know there was local elections and things like that. I mean, what was your turnout like, even with the disaster?
It was a high turnout.
It was very high turnout.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of showing what you all did, is to say, look, we tried to protect the community. We tried to get as many services up and running as we can. And you know what? We know that you all want to vote. You want to make decisions for your community and for your country, your community, state, and country. And just to be able to provide that opportunity, I didn't know that. I knew a lot of the things you all are talking about, but I didn't know about that. And that's fantastic to let people, give them an opportunity to do it and do it properly.
If you think about and it's not just the election day on November 4th, early voting, it was not, they didn't even have to adjust the dates on that. So it's mid-October, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're September 27th, you have the floods, and 2.5, 3 weeks later, early voting happens on schedule. That was a huge accomplishment for just everybody as a team.
Yeah. And so what I definitely want to talk about too, because everything we've kind of talked about is everything was centralized still in Cocke County. Well, there's an anomaly there. And that was when, the jail was uninhabitable. The jail annex was uninhabitable, which held the majority of your inmates. And what you ended up doing is working out a lease agreement for basically, what is it, $1 a month?
It's $1 a month, and
Right.
we have to maintain the maintenance of the facility. And anything, that pops up that's got to be fixed, for $1 a month, maintenance, our biggest, and I'll say the biggest thing is, years ago, the old jail's never been allowed to cook food. I think they may have shut it down in like early 2000s. So, our main kitchen was an annex. So, and when we moved to Jefferson County, that was another obstacle we had to come across, because they didn't have a kitchen. They had a kitchen, but they didn't have appliances, didn't have things to cook or anything like that. So we had to start transitioning, things and start purchasing things to get a kitchen up and going, which took, I think, roughly between 30 to 35 days, may have been a tad longer. I know it was all the month of October, and it may have been November, and may have been about 10 days into December. So yeah, we had several days where Jefferson County was taking care of the inmates in Jefferson County. But, we had to pay for that. We got a bill, we had to pay for that and things like that. But they had to feed them. Well, at the old jail, we was able to get our inmates back up and going. I think it took us about 3-4 weeks to get the old jail to where we could get back in it. Don't have a kitchen. So, and working well with TCI, we had churches and we had, restaurants that were providing food, more like a catering type thing to keep them fed too. So it was, there's a lot of obstacles.
Yeah. And so for anyone who's going to be watching this, kind of in a nutshell, the largest jail you had was uninhabitable. You worked out with Jefferson County they had a workhouse that they were not utilizing, that they vacated. You all had to repair that. You leased it. They were kind enough to allow you to lease that for a nominal fee, but you're responsible for the maintenance. Still huge cost, and getting it up to speed. And you were able to get it certified all within a year. I'll say that with, being TCI, that's not an easy thing to do in a year.
No, the certification. I mean, I know you go to about the minimum standard, but just the certificate, and that obviously we've had to put a lot into that facility, but a lot of that is reimbursable, from the federal government whenever everything gets said and done. But the overall challenge was how's your employees going to react to this transition?
Well, talk about that for a second. Meaning that how many miles is it from your old or the facility that
I'd say to and from. I mean, you're probably looking at probably 11 miles.
Okay.
11 total miles,
Each way?
each way. So you're looking about 22, 25 miles. Just depends on the direction you go.
Well, let's talk about time to get there.
Yeah, you're looking at 30 minutes, 30-minute drive, 30-minute back. So you're looking at an hour. And when they applied to work here. I was like, my biggest fear was how many employees it's going to affect. And to be honest with you, it didn't affect them. They came to work. They didn't. Those saying is they didn't bat an eye. They just kept on going in and kept going to work and fighting through and still fighting through. But we have a good staff overall. But in the corrections part, these corrections officers continue to show up. They go to work, and my hat's off to them and that administration because. We were so close to a jail certification outside, the overpopulation and overcrowding of that one. But the one right before the flood, all their paperwork was great. Everything they were doing was tremendous, and that's the only thing. They were good, and they were so happy. And now that where we're at now, you get a jail certification a year after a major disaster, but it was because of them. They showed up. They done what they're supposed to. They continue to work with each other, and then that's why we got a certificate. And it took a lot. They could all just walked out the door and quit, and then we'd just been up a creek. But the main thing was they didn't stop. They kept coming in and kept performing. So you can't do it without them.
And some people don't understand that that's still a jail. So any court hearings. Attorney visits, maybe they're nice enough to come all the way to Jefferson County, but I'm sure that's not always the case.
No, and they've worked well with us on that.
Oh yeah, it seems like they've really tried to. I'm not speaking to any of them. I just know some of the other challenges when, they were remodeling something or had to move some inmates for particular reasons. But you're talking about a strain on your resources for transportation, where before it was right across the street. They go to court, or they'll have multiple hearings, or there's so many things involved that no one just stays there. They go to court and then they stay in jail. It doesn't work that way.
Well, and like I said, we've got inmates as far as Loudoun County. So but now the courts, even the day of the flood, obviously not the day of the flood, but the judicial system reached out. What can we do?
Absolutely.
We're like, well, we're printing off rosters. What we need, and they, obviously they couldn't get to the courthouse, but they can keep up with that. And they're like, what can we do? I'm like, well, let's look at every inmate, see what their charges are, and let's start getting people out. It's kind of like COVID. You got to get people out. So the main thing was go back and look at very mild, misdemeanor cases where they've done enough time, or if it hadn't even been sentenced and it was very low, they could give them a bond and let them get out. So we was able to trim that down. We had 170 some inmates incarcerated a week or two before the flood, and we started going to the courts. Hey, we need help getting some of these out. We got too many incarcerated, and they released around 30. So I'm like, well, I'm glad they did that before the flood. Not knowing it was coming, but we communicate with the courts. They communicate with us, but they still get tied up because they have a lot of rulings, but the attorneys, usually like the court clerks, they'll send transport orders for us to go to Loudoun County or something and bring the inmate back for them to facilitate their visit. Or a lot of your attorneys, they'll try to wait,
So they have to come to court.
They have to come to court, and they can take them back in the room and do their thing, or, we'll go pick them up on a Friday, and then they've got Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, if they want to facilitate that. But, overall, the court system, they've got a tough job. For us, we're like, okay, they're in here a misdemeanor, let's get them out of here, but they have to go by their rules.
Well, and that's one of the things, I try to bring up the point too, that, anyone who's not worked in law enforcement or corrections or public safety or, in any realm of that, many times if I'm some of the general public and when I've gone around the state, and we talked about this before, that they think it's just the county jail and that's where the local, public drunks go and things like that. But what we were talking about before we started this was one of the things I like to bring up, and it's not a great thing, but it's the truth, that you can look at, you might have Otis from Andy Griffith, who's there every other week because he got too drunk and is laying on the street and you got to take him in, right? For public intox. But then also Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Charles Manson spent months and years in local county jails before they were ever convicted of the heinous crimes that they committed.
And for each one of those, how many tens of thousands of violent criminals and sexual predators are also in those facilities?
They always start out in the local jail and usually spend a significant amount of time before they're ever sentenced and eligible to go to a prison. And I always like to bring that to light. And then now you guys are having to essentially flip the bill to transport not just Otis, but Ted Bundy.
Yeah.
Hannibal Lecter
back and
all
forth to the court system and hearings. And usually when someone's that dangerous or, a child predator or a sex trafficker, and you're having to transport them back and forth, to those services, it's not only costing you money, it's safety. And we're a year out, and that's where we can go next. It's like, even though I've really been along for the ride, as far as like from the state perspective and trying to assist you guys and getting these things moved forward with, because it's not just the jail, it's the court, it's offices, it's the election. There's so many things, but the jail comes up a lot because it is the most expensive building, because it's the cornerstone of your public safety. It is the building that holds the most dangerous people in your community at that time. And you have to have a safe facility and an ability to do that. And that's not cheap construction. You can't just throw up sheetrock walls and put a bunch of people around the perimeter, because the chances of escape or something happening or burning. The reason there's jail standards and codes related to building those jails is because of the individuals that you're holding there. So that's always a point of contention. That's always going to be number one as far as public contention, because it's such an expensive building to build.
And it doesn't provide a return. It's an expense, not an investment.
It's 70% of your liability. Yeah. That building is 70% of your liability countywide.
And I think it's something that something CJ touched on. I want to make sure that we address. For one, I just wanted to he's a modest guy. I want to brag on him. They've been tremendous to work with. They have Sheriff and his whole team have made this as they've really taken a lot of the load off of for the rest of us. They've not tried to put that burden on us. He has taken that burden on himself and his team, and they have done a tremendous job. Something I think is, he gave me a list a few weeks ago, 6 or 7 counties I think we have inmates, right, across East Tennessee.
Yeah, that we've used, yeah. I'd say we're probably about 5 or 6 now, but yeah.
Right, yeah, 5 or 6. And we've got that one big facility in Jefferson County, but we've still got 4 or 5 other counties that are housing our inmates. And they're transporting from all over East Tennessee, and his team is doing that. And what that's done, and this, what we're seeing the numbers prove out now, that take what it was costing us to run the old facility, the jail that we had here, take that, add an additional $2 million a year to that until we get this new facility built here in the county. So as long as we're transporting all over East Tennessee, that's an additional $2 million. It's just costing us.
Going out the door.
Going out the door, exactly right.
And not to the benefit of public safety, because
right.
you're having to transport people in a lot of high risk situations going on there. And that's one of the things I always like to talk about is that it's not just, oh, well, they've got them over there, we'll just move them over here. It doesn't work. It doesn't work that way, because what it does is it stretches everything in public safety. It's not like people quit committing crimes and you still have deputies that are working all over the county in harsh conditions, or you have, people who are working with EMA or services that are having to be stretched to do billings and things like that with these different agencies across the state that you're having to house people. The resources we're still the same.
Mm-hmm.
And, with you guys being a rural and distressed county,
Mm-hmm.
there's not resources there. You don't have a grant writer that sits on your staff. You don't have two attorneys advising you on how to properly go out and get these grants. It's you two and your staff. That's who's doing all the hard work on this, as far as like the administrative piece of it. And I think that's why a lot of our state stakeholders, it's not that, because you guys are tough. You're the toughest bunch of people that I've seen in public safety to go, you know what? That's not okay. That I'm just not going to take no for an answer there, because we're going to fight for our citizens, and we're going to fight for the things that we're doing. And sometimes that bureaucratic nonsense, when you don't have the resources of a larger metropolitan area, I think it's been great that you guys have said, look, I'm going to go out and try to find these resources and find these things. And it's a testament to what we were all talking about being partners early on. But with that said, where are we at on any of that? Now, I know the answer to some of these because I've worked specifically on the jail side with you all, but I want to talk about where we started once we started to assess it as a whole county, dealing with, let's talk about the state and FEMA, and kind of where we are in those processes, and kind of where we think we're going, and what we see, and what some of the problems have been, and some of the bright side. And I definitely want to talk about those things, because those things I think are going to be a great lesson in how to do things, and understanding that not everyone has the resources to take 7 lawyers with the federal government and navigate every single piece of paper. I got a little problem with bureaucracy, if y'all haven't noticed that. But to go through those things and try to dot every I and cross every T, yet your resources are already stretched across the county because of all the different things that you all are doing, and reaching into other counties with having to transport people and extra money going out, but you don't have a person walking by your side who's a professional grant writer or a professional contract attorney, and people who do these things. It's really you two and your staff that are having to deal with every bit of this. So let's talk about it from the beginning, how it started once you, relative to the jail annex courts. We'll talk about that building specifically.
Sure. And before we get into that, I was kind of put a finer point on the $2 million a year that it's costing us. We only collect around $17 million a year in property tax. So you're talking about just the increase is more than 10% of what we collect annually in property taxes. Wow. So that's putting a tremendous strain. And it's also, it creates even more stress on us financially to solve this quickly. And that's why any delay that we see is really it really causes a lot of problems. We are very grateful to Governor Lee and his administration, because they've helped us to there's some appropriations that have been made for other things, or some grants, matching funds that have been waived, that are helping us to get through the first couple of years of this. So that's getting us a little bit of runway that we can to help get this solved, but we got to get it solved. So, Sheriff, if you want to talk to it, we can let you start off with that.
But I mean, like he's talking about the jail. We've had to extend our employment. You're talking about money. We've had to extend the transportation. We had 2 transportation officers for the entire county, for the entire jail facility. And I mean, you could have one of those end up in Florida or California or New York City picking up an inmate that has to come back to Tennessee, which puts you down to 1, but now with all these transportations, we run court, at least with inmate population, criminal type court is twice every week, and then if you got criminal court going on, then you're looking at 3 to 4 days, so we've had to expand our transport officers by 4. So where we had 2, now we have 4. Court security officers, we've had to expand court security. We've had to expand, the jail correctional, I think we had to expand it by 4, and then we had to expand patrol. We was able to add 2 more patrol officers, because, when all that happened, obviously North Carolina, we had an MOU with them. They couldn't get to this side. So we're having to go outside the state answer calls of service there to help them because nobody could get to them. So, and when you get into talking about the funding, we've had to expand big time because we have to, no matter what happens, and yourself, state law plainly says that we have to provide the services to the sheriff's office to maintain what the law says. So even the county just like, well, I don't know if we can do that. Then you got state law says, no, you have to do that. So that puts them in a predicament like, well, we got to do that. And if we didn't do that and did not hire and add these positions, then we would be violating, inmate civil rights violation. We'd be violating, Supreme Court rulings in the courts and them not being able to get to their
duty
trials.
to intervene stuff too. It's
rehabilitation.
Right.
We're having to transport all these inmates to and from court. Now we've had to go and put on hold of transporting people to rehabs because, well, we've got to get them here before we can get them there. But we've been able to come up with some kind of grant funding with that to try to help get a transport van and, continue the transportation and making sure we're doing all people the same.
Well, and really, when you talk about that, people need to understand that was just to stop the bleeding, and that's the tough part. Sometimes, that the public and kind of even in other governmental agencies that don't sit in your two guys' seat, they don't understand how taxed you are already, and you try to do the most with the least. Hey, how can we make it work? And then that was just to stop the bleeding. And I think you all have done a phenomenal job with that. It's just amazing to see how much you all are. It's what prompted me to do this is the fact that you all, I've never seen something like this happen in Tennessee. I've been in Tennessee since 1991 but I've worked for the state since 2013, worked in Rutherford County. But looking back, I don't remember anything. I remember a tornado came through downtown Clarksville and, the jail caught some damage, but nothing. I remember just a direct smack dab hit on the county's infrastructure, specifically the jail, court, law enforcement. And to see how you all did this and you're rolling distressed, it's just phenomenal. And if anything, I want to brag on you all, say, if people think there isn't hope, you did it with minimal resources and you did it and you're continuing to do it here a year later. And it's just phenomenal to see you all do that because sure, we're a partner, but comparative to the work that you all have done, I'm happy to be able to assist, happy to be able to do those things. And I hope everyone's looking at it that way. But I do want to say,
we sure are. We thank you for that.
Well, no, it's just amazing to see the work that you all are doing. And I feel like I'm not doing enough. Well, what I mean?
It's, what happens.
Yeah.
And if you just give up, I'm like, you know what? There ain't nothing we can do. And you can't be that way because, especially, in the positions that we hold, public safety's priority. And, we're like, no matter what happens, no matter how bad, the worst disaster, I've been part of 3 now.
Mm-hmm.
We had a tornado in 2011. We worked that. Obviously, that hit more of the city of Newport. Still had a lot of wind damage in the county and things like that, but we had to come to the city and help them and do things we had to do. We responded to the Gatlinburg fires, the night of, the day after, days after, and to see what they had to go through dealing with that, and now you've had Hurricane Helene hit, but you have to keep moving forward, and even though you're like, it's never happened, nothing like this has ever happened. And you're like, well, how in the world are you supposed to combat this? But you look at the surrounding, you all have to work together. You have to communicate. And you also, as the leader, you have to be responsible, to make sure that everything's done. Like we have to go to the EMA building because that's where the staging's at. Well, I can't be still. And I cannot be staged. I mean, if I didn't cut my own hair, I'd be up wandering around the barbershop. But, my thing is I've got to get out. I got to leave. I've got to go out and see what's going on because, I just, you have to be out there with them. And, if you go back and reflect back and, we did lose 2 lives, but if you go back, if people just seen, especially the first responders, when they were going out and some of the things I've seen and the videos and the pictures, and I'm thinking, I mean, how did no one else, lose their life? And hear some of the stories from all of the first responders. It's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe he was in such a, in that shape, even after the flood, it was going out, roads missing and driving through water. But to reflect back on what they did that day and days after, they didn't hesitate, and you can't, you can have fear and you can be scared, but you can't hesitate to do your job. And I cannot go back and, that was like me, how do you hand out award pins? You can't, because if I got one that's 400 miles long, that would be the award I'd have to give everybody that was responsive that day. Because, you always get a challenge coin, you always get a pin to put on your shirt and uniform. But, either the ones that was on the front line that was in the 8 foot of water, or they were rescuing people from the helicopters or whatever, those days, you got the dispatchers, you've got the people out here at the building, monitoring the traffic, trying to take care of the people to come and get their water and food. You got the corrections officers, you got the firefighters, you got the volunteers, you got the electrical workers, you got the gas, everybody.
And you have even community members,
volunteers.
Just jumped out there and said, that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, realtors, churches, everybody. There's not one person you can single out that did not do something during that time, because everybody's job, even if it was small or big, it was the same job, because what you did benefited everybody, not just one person. So, they're just, the whole county ought to get the Golden Globe Award, and the people that came in, the volunteers, it's remarkable. But until you've been in it and you've seen it, you do not know. But for us, it's been an eye opener. You learn from things that happen like this. What can you do better? What did we do bad? But you have to move forward regardless of how it was. You still have to just go on and say, okay, if it happens again, we're going to do it this way or do it that way. It's just, there's a lot.
There's no perfect answer to it. And again, going back to, it's not like crime is stopping. It's not like people aren't needing services through the county. It's not. I
don't know if crime stops, but I'll tell you this.
Slow down.
If criminal activity was going on, either they took care of it themselves, because they didn't call. We had some calls here and there, a few things, but, most people, even ones that make the mistakes, I think they realize, this is
serious.
I might be good for just a few days, but our calls of service, outside just emergency response and a few things here and there, we didn't have, so there's several days that went by where you just really didn't, obviously you got domestics often. I'm like, did we have any domestics? I'm like, I don't think we did, and if we did, we didn't hear back because these other counties could have responded, but it just.
But in the aftermath of it, and you all having to deal and continuing every day, it's not like once all the power came back on, people could drink the water and the waters receded. It's not like you all were just handed back the position you were. You were stretched. You're still continuing to respond. You're still probably dealing with disaster recovery in certain areas, whether it's roads or access or anything.
And the businesses, the affected businesses, it's unbelievable. Because, if you'd been downtown, especially where the downtown businesses got hit, and then you go down there today and you're like, I would have never imagined that would have been up and going today.
It kind of shocked me because when I first came down right afterwards, I was driving through with Dietz when we were coming through yesterday, and I was looking for a water line because I remember when I first came through, I couldn't find a water line. I mean, I know it's all documented, but I just kind of wanted to show him, like, hey, when we're driving through your business district before you get up here, I was saying, well, you see that door, it's about halfway up that door. I remember the video, but also seeing the water line, where there's still like a stain on the side of the building. And it's pretty amazing to see how the community has started to recover. And, I know you all are trying to grow commerce and bring people. I know that put a big, hiccup, but it's amazing to see the people who are here and the support y'all have given them for businesses and things like that. I've worked some disasters like post-hurricane, post-tornadoes, and many times it's a ghost town for a long time. It's remarkable to see some of the bounce back and the resiliency of the community. It really is. It's
the big
remarkable.
thing was, especially people you didn't know. I mean, you'd had numbers pop up on your phone, and I'm tell you, I looked down on Saturday, or it may have been Saturday evening. I had like 1,400 text messages that I hadn't opened.
I had to give my phone when we were in the command center. I gave my wife. She came to volunteer, and she just handled all the communications. She's like email, telephone, and because it was like. In the command center, it was like, okay, you have to make a decision in 10 seconds. Next decision is due in 20 seconds. And these were not small decisions. And in the meanwhile, you just don't have time to even just look at your phone. So she screened all that to make sure no critical communications slipped through. And thank God she did, because there was a lot of critical communications coming through there. But she was able to slip in between the hey you stuff, the face-to-face and the radio, and we're able to get it all addressed and nothing slipped through the cracks. But that's something we hadn't planned for. And thank God she was there to do that. And that whole team, the volunteers showed up. But like Sheriff's saying, the volume of incoming communications was overwhelming.
And that was one of them things where, and most all those people that called, left voicemails, emails, they just want to know where to go. Where do we start helping? So, the big thing for us was, especially the deputies, they would respond back, well, this place was hit, this place was hit, this place was hit. So every place was hit. I just made my own little note card, copied and pasted it, and sent it to them. So this is the affected areas. This is where it's at. It's whether it's in Bivey, whether it's in Del Rio, Edwina, Cosby, downtown. And said, this is the places that were hit. These are the places that are affected. So, I was just copying and pasting and sending it back because, there's people from all over the United States. And I'm like, golly, bum, and then they're like, because I don't know anything about backhoes or anything like that, but I can say they probably need them. But they just show.
Well, that stretches your resources too, just that recovery or the influx of resources that are coming in, how to coordinate all of that, or even when it comes down to where do I put all this water?
Yeah, that was a big challenge.
This water they sent us, and how do I get someone to coordinate that when these services are already. That becomes a lot, and some people don't recognize that either. And you're probably still dealing with some of those logistics on.
Yeah, we obviously had the one out here at the old Walmart was a big place, but every one of these nonprofits and these churches, they just open their doors.
They all turn into supply depots.
Yeah,
and the way that worked was really just amazing. It's you're talking about everybody pulling together. It's in a time of crisis, whether it's a family, a business, a community, whatever group it is, you're either going to pull together or fall apart. And that's a choice that has to be made. And thankfully, our community as a whole, our county and our whole region said, we're going to pull together. And that's what made all the difference. Like you're talking about, the recovery from the counties and everything. And talking about the water. We went from, oh my goodness, how are we going to get water to everybody? How are we going to get enough water to, okay, where are we going to put this water to, okay, how are we going to get this water out? To what? And then at the end, what are we going to do with all this water? So it was just kind of solving one. It's like a puzzle. You're having to solve one puzzle after another. But thank God that the puzzles we went from the scariest puzzle was how are we going to get enough water? After that, it was managing those resources. Okay, we've got the water. How do we manage this to get it to the people that need it? That is so much better a problem to be solving than we don't have the water to give them.
How do we get to people to bring them to the medical care they need?
Speaking of water, the hospital would have shut down.
Yeah, the hospital would shut down.
It came this close to shutting down because they have to have water to operate, obviously, and there was no water. So our volunteer fire departments for 2 weeks shuttled water from Jefferson County, the nearest potable water source, to the hospital 4 trips a day to keep the doors open. And the CEO told us that had the doors closed, because of the economic climate that we're in at the time, had those doors closed, they probably would not open back up. So we would have actually just lost the hospital.
And I mean, all your volunteer fire departments was open, your school system was open. All these places, they were a hub for everything to come to. And I mean, we had helicopters flying food in, to each district, that was affected, and they're just trying to get them food, trying to get things to them. And it was overwhelming, to see what you had and what took place. And, they brought it in. I didn't even know they could bring food in from a helicopter until I met the pilot. He called me. I'm like, well, what do you need? And he said, well, I'm flying food. I'm like, working on land that, of course, Gracie Fork's got a landing zone. Basically every one of your schools in the county could land a helicopter.
I mean, not that it's that far reaching, because I live in East Tennessee as well, in Roane County. But a friend of mine working through some church and other people, that's what he did every weekend, was come up and get to the areas that up in the mountains, because he comes here to fish, and he works construction, but he just loves this area, and that became his outreach every weekend. And I believe he's still helping, trying to coordinate things, from outside the county with you guys to try to reach those areas. If, even like in the aftermath, not that you guys aren't doing a great job. He says it's amazing to see, he didn't think it'd ever at this point be in in those areas that he was going to be that accessible from what he saw. But it just, again, testifies to what you all did as a community to come
a
together.
big thing for us, another big thing, obviously every bridge in this county that one of those rivers or something crossed, they're closed down. I mean, because your architects, TDOT, and all them employees had to come in and start checking bridges before you could even go across them. And if you can't cross a bridge, you can't get to the community. And it was, just coming from TDOT's perspective, getting these bridges opened back up as quick as possible, safely, to make sure. And I'm like, I just don't, and these bridges took major hits, and it just, it was one of them things where just like everything mattered. And everybody had to work together. If not, it would have been a complete failure.
Well, the thing that provided me some perspective, because I come to Newport, but it's right, not too far off the interstate, so I come to Newport to visit you guys, and I've never really been out in the rural areas. But the year before, in 23, I went to Barbarossa because it was a friend's birthday party, and they had a band, and they invited us out, and so we came out for that. And then when I saw on the news and the bridges and that place was just completely wiped out,
gone. Yeah.
I was like, okay, now I have some perspective on what that was, because it was gone. I mean, it was just gone. Yeah.
And that was just one of 3 rivers.
That was the thing. Yeah, that was just the small snapshot of something I'd been to for a half a day. And at least knowing what was there, and then the bridge going there, and the things that were leading up to it, and seeing what you all did it was something. I'll say that much. It was something just from my perspective, to come and see something like that. But just seeing downtown Newport, I can't imagine where the water was rushing to down in these communities in Cosby and some of these others that they're probably still having to deal with. But that's what also I want to talk about is, one of the things I know we've dealt with since day one. We could talk about all the state resources, and thank you. Now I'll pass it on to the governor's administration about what you said about them really trying to help and assist.
They stepped up huge. Yeah.
And but the one thing, part of this long-term disaster planning, one of the things that I know right now is somewhat of a hiccup, and we've worked as partners together to try to get this jail and criminal justice situation figured out. So even though I know the story, I want you all to tell the story and then kind of where we're at today, as far as the planning, how it started, what everything that led up to today.
Well, you want me to? Okay. Well, as you know, as we've discussed, the flood knocked the jail out, and everything that was in that whole structure was essentially destroyed. And it's the damage. So Sheriff Ball, again, got to commend him. He had some structural engineers to come in immediately after the flood, did an evaluation. They measured the cracks and everything, and then looked at did an analysis. It didn't look as bad at first, and then they came back 4 months later and looked again and realized that what had happened was the ground underneath the jail and that whole structure had been so heavily damaged that it was collapsing under the building. So the building was just, the building was no longer stable. And in order for that structure to be salvaged, I wouldn't even say repaired, just salvaged to make it somewhat safe, we would have to put 40 to 50 foot concrete pylons every 4 feet on center on every load bearing wall in that facility to get down to bedrock.
So it would have been, you have basically had to tear the building down to be most cost effective to even be able to start over again.
It's like a car. If a car's worth $10,000 and you got $20,000 worth of damage, one of those situations. So that's what we're facing with the jail out there. And then so we, of course, FEMA came and engaged early on, and it was very encouraging. And as you said, we had so many pieces. We had the jail, the highway department, the roads, all of the equipment, the highway departments, the majority of their vehicles got swamped when the floods. So they got destroyed. It's like I equated it to our Air Force being destroyed on the ground. Because as soon as the water goes, one of the first things you want is your highway department out there fixing roads. Well, their equipment was knocked out. So we had no Air Force, right? So, but to get back to the jail, we engaged with FEMA, TEMA, and you all, and everybody that we could. First off, as the sheriff said, trying to make sure the inmates are taken care of and all that situation is stabilized, stop the bleeding. And then we started looking at, okay, where do we go from here? And we got the thanks to the engineer report that FEMA did an on-site inspection, and something else happened in the midst of that it was kind of a formality. It's a substantial damage estimate, and that's something that's kind of it's a form. It's a FEMA form. You check the box, and you fill it out. Well, the city it's in the city limits, so the city had a contractor to come in and do it. I'm sure the person was not a licensed engineer, but I'm sure they're a contractor. And there were 2 signatures on it. Was the individual and they hired him in from up in Northeast Tennessee, and also they had somebody that works. She was taking a gap year, a college student working an internship, had come in and was working for the city, and that was her role, was to help with that. Right. So those are the 2 signatories on there, and so we got we got our engineering estimate in, and then FEMA looked at it and said, "Yeah, you guys need a new jail." And then so you wrote a letter saying, "Hey, for this new jail to be certified, it's going to have 216 beds. The old facility was 88 beds." And FEMA standard is they rebuild in kind plus codes and standards. Well, Tennessee code, that's a law.
Yeah, and just so for our listeners, it wasn't some arbitrary number. We worked with the University of Tennessee County Technical Assistance Service. They came out, performed analysis, looked at jail populations over years, you name it. And we took that, we evaluated that report, we evaluated everything associated with it. And that was in record time that CTAS redid that, I might add, and also putting price estimates together. But just so they, anyone who's listening Will didn't come in there with an arbitrary number, but you need 216 beds. There's a lot of work put into that, and based off things, for them to have that. So yes, that was for what the time frame was and everything that was placed in front of it, and historical numbers. That was the minimum.
It was
was being recommended.
The bare minimum.
That was the bare minimum.
Yeah.
That really for those who listen, even though we were talking 150 inmates at the time, there were peaks where you were up around 200 in your entire population or more, and keeping predators, John Wayne Gacy, away from Otis is a very important part of what you do of people in your custody. And so part of that is you want to have beds open, and that's part of that. And that was absolutely the bare minimum recommendation in that study. And it's not often that we as the state go, yep, that's what needs to happen. But it is, because otherwise that would have been unmaintainable, at least that quick.
Well, you
I should
talk
say.
about,
So we did it in record time.
Sure.
We were able to examine everything, go back. I reviewed everything. Me and my team reviewed everything, going back to validate all of that, and it was spot on for the minimum. So,
and that goes back to, like, we're talking about the accountability piece, and the accountability implies, there's standards, and so we have to work within those standards. So we sent that letter to FEMA along with any other documentation that we had. To the people that were working our case, and they gave it to their attorney, and we got a copy of the email. One of their attorneys said, "Yeah, this is Codes and Standards." And once they got that, and we gave them a copy of your study and how you came to the numbers and everything else, and we were getting the costing down for that. So okay, and we actually have the county owns a piece of land that's perfectly suited for that, great location. So that was what we were moving forward with, and then. Didn't get any correspondence back for a few weeks, and I thought this silence is usually not good, So we reached back out and said, "Hey, how are things going on the bed count?" And they said, "Yeah, the determination's been made. We're going to back it off to 88 beds." And so we said, "Well, that's not going to work for us. We need to have a get together." And that's when we had a June 2nd, I believe it was, of this year. You came down, and thank you for that. We had representatives from our congressional delegation, from FEMA, all the agencies involved. The sheriff was here, and we had to talk about that. And we decided, okay, we're going to need to really look at this and figure this out. What's the best solution here? Because if we build a jail that's not going to be certified, we can't occupy. We're going to build an empty facility because we can't occupy an uncertified jail. So, it doesn't do us much good to build something that's not going to be certified, put it that way. So that was a conversation. And of course, then there was a congressional inquiry that I guess one of the staffers thought, well, we just need to do an inquiry. And then that happened. And I think that that may have damaged the goodwill between us and FEMA at that point. So, we got some feedback that was not great. So that became a bone of contention. And then so a little bit later on, we went back and forth with them, and they just kind of like, instead of the conversation, that was just kind of like two sets of trenches dug in, across from each other. That kind of hardened everybody's position. And then so they showed us a page from literally the third from the last page of the whole FEMA manual out of like 370 some odd pages. It was like page 371 out of 375, something like that. And they said, cannot expand for capacity. And we thought, well, it's really not capacity. It's still Codes and Standards, but okay, well, this is dragging on way too long.
And was that line specifically about jails?
No, I don't think it was specifically about jails. It was just in general. It was more like schools, things and that's one of the things too, is, we're talking about why has this been so difficult? And you made I think a lot of it's due to the point you made was, this doesn't happen to jails very often, even, not just in the state of Tennessee, but as a whole.
As a whole, in the United States. Everybody
that we've talked to I talked to several folks with FEMA, they said, we've never done a jail before. So, when you're talking about capacity, or not even capacity, but bed count, human rights issues, state law, things of that nature, FEMA will follow local ordinances and consider that Codes and Standards or even local government policy, as long as it's in writing before the event. Right. So, and if we're thinking, okay, well, this is state law that was in place before the event. So that was our case that we tried to make. Well, we went back and they showed us that piece of evidence, and we were on the verge of saying, okay, you know what, we'll go with 88, and then we'll try to get help from the state to do the rest, or whatever we need to do. We'll try to figure this out because we need to get moving on this. Right. And the next day, when we were going to say, okay, that we're just going to go with 88 beds, the very next day we get another correspondence from FEMA saying, you know what, that damage estimate that was in the meanwhile so to backtrack just a piece, the sheriff had the engineers to come out in January, they came out right after the floods. Right. In January, the substantial damage estimate, which is kind of a thing you have to check off. Well, this, and then after that, the engineers came out and did the stamped report that showed the cracks, new cracks forming. The ground underneath is unstable. And that's what gave us the go ahead. And FEMA did the determination. If it's anything over 50%, it's not repair, it's replace. That's the standard. So we had 58% damage. And they said, well, this building's a very old building and it had pre-existing issues, I'm sure. So that 58% went down to 52% to accommodate for the age and status, pre-existing status of the building, which is still over 50%, which means still replace. Well, that substantial damage estimate that I'd alluded to that had been done by the contractor that came in had one statement in it, and it said, due to the age and pre-existing conditions of this building, we're cutting the value by 75%, the book value by 75%.
Wow.
Yeah. And like, well, this individual did not see the building before the flood, so how do they know? Furthermore, they're not specifically what issues are we talking about?
And you're talking about time period there between, how do they know when it's, how long did you say?
This was in January, so this is like September to
so
October, November, December, so 4 months after the fact. Yeah, 3.5 to 4 months after the fact. This has been looked at and it's like, oh, it's pre-existing. Well, okay. If we said that this is a specific, there's one standard of evidence for us, because that's why we had to get the engineers to say, hey, look, this is flood related. We had to show receipts and get absolute proof to FEMA that this is flood related, and that's what we did. But that same standard of evidence doesn't seem to follow going the opposite direction. If somebody comes in 4 months after, who's not an engineer, and says, at least to my knowledge is not an engineer, and says, yeah, there's pre-existing stuff. Okay, specifically what?
Yeah, well, I mean, see, exactly, like there it should be reciprocal, right?
It should be, yeah.
Where you're, show me the engineering report and the tolerances based on, where it should have been, where it was. I mean,
show me the evidence that says that warrants 75%. There's no pictures, and there's no pictures of this. We have an engineering report that thick that's got pictures, documentation. This is a 1 or 2 page. It's a standard form, and this is just one of the boxes on the standard form. And that was the argument that we made. It was like, yeah, we know there was some pre-existing stuff just based on the age of the building. The buildings, we've got the maintenance records. It's well maintained. It's been inspected, as
annually,
twice
exactly. Annually,
exactly. So none of those issues. So what issues are we talking about here with the building? And so we're taking that word, and that going from the 58% initial to 52 is like, yeah, we've already accounted for the fact that it's an older building. It's going to have some issues. That's why I went from 58 to 52. So this document is actually, other than slashing the value by 75%, which I think is debatable, the statement that there were pre-existing issues, that's already been addressed in the lowering of the damage estimate from 58 to 52. We're in agreement on that. This document is agreement with everything that we're saying. But now FEMA said, well, that takes it below 50%. This document takes your damage estimate below 50%, so we're not replacing anything. So now we are in the position, we have taken 2 steps back from where we were in March, let's say, March of this year, where we were talking to FEMA about building a 216-bed facility down to an 88-bed, now to nothing. So where we stand with that now, we have hired consultants to help us to conduct the appeal with FEMA. They've given us the decision. We have 60 days to file an appeal. They're helping us to put that together. So it's not like saying I appeal. You have to essentially put together your case when you file it.
I'm totally,
it's like a court case.
I'm totally being facetious here, or contrary, I should say. So you didn't have your engineering or legal department handle any of that?
Yeah, they were. Yeah, our legal department and our engineer.
You know what I mean? Like
our staff engineers.
Yeah,
and our staff, staff FEMA handlers. Those folks that we keep on hand. It's just us and our staff, and we didn't need the consultants because things were going.
Seemed like they were going in the right direction
until they weren't, and then so now they took a hard left, and now we're hiring consultants. And also, I want to thank you, and the 3 of us went to visit the governor's chief of staff, and we are requesting help from the governor in his upcoming budget because we're the only distressed county that was hit in this disaster. And if you look at the amount of relief funds that have gone to the counties, we've received about $20 million less than their three hardest hit counties were Unicoi County, Carter County, and Cocke County. And if you look at the three, we have received about a little over $20 million less than any of those counties has received. So that was a part of the case that we made was, hey, we just want to be brought up with them and maybe a little bit more because we have more expensive damages and we're distressed. So maybe we need a little more help, and that's what we're here to ask for. And we're very thankful to the governors and his administration for having an open ear for that. So that's our plan going forward. If we can win the appeal with FEMA and get the help we need from the governor's administration, then we can get over this hurdle. And again, to your point, that's just the jail part. We're not even talking about rebuilding. Right now we are in a shopping mall. We're in a strip mall. We're between a gym and Tractor Supply.
Well, I think what I'm going to say here, it shouldn't be, this shouldn't be controversial that disaster money is meant for disasters, and your public safety has been affected. And the fact that, I mean, and I know that they came back with, basically you need to replace it, but to try to be as nice as I can, that's what FEMA money is supposed to do, is to protect the public and to help do those things. But instead, because you don't have an engineering department, because you don't have a legal department that can fight those battles, you're left holding the bag when that's what FEMA is supposed to be for disasters and to help recover from those disasters for the citizens, for the safety of the community. And I'm a little disappointed at the fact that the bureaucracy of all of that, because I mean, I remember after it happened, it seemed like nothing happened, and then we get a new administration in, and you start seeing things move
for a couple months.
Yeah, and they start moving, and you see it over in North Carolina. You start seeing things when we get the new president. It was pretty phenomenal to see how much can be done in a period of time. And then it's like, okay, well, on to the next thing. And I'm not saying that that's the administration.
No.
But you wonder what the people who work, and I've spoken with some, and they'll probably hate me and never want to deal with me again with FEMA. That seemed like, we were trying to get all the information over to them, provide, look, what we see on average cost for jails. We were doing calculations on, studying like, okay, what are the population estimates? And that only shows one thing, but to kind of show what square footage is and those things, and just throw it out there to them to try to at least give them something on the conservative end to say this, and then watching it kind of die on the vine because someone dug two ditches and, both of them had their heels in them, when I would disagree with that, because you haven't dug a ditch. You all haven't dug a ditch. What you're trying to do is recover. And to me, that's what FEMA, and I'm not going to even get into what FEMA's been spending money on the last couple of years, because when it should be for the citizens of this county, of this state, of this country, who are dealing with disasters. So yeah, not trying to get political there, but it's the truth. And the thing is this is a perfect instance of a situation where I would really, what's right is right. And that's the thing that I'm struggling with and helping through this process, not just to document this. I totally didn't mean to go off on kind of this tirade, but the more we talk about it, the more I hear about it. It's really frustrating to see that rural distressed county, who's done a phenomenal job at getting back to a sense of normalcy, and now they're going to have to flip the bill for the most expensive building to build in their county, which means raising taxes, which means doing those things. I mean, sure, you've got a responsibility as a county to build your county jail, but you don't experience disaster and things that are meant to be federal aid related for FEMA to your infrastructure, which there's a process for, and then using something on page 511 to say that this is not okay.
Well, the messaging when
It's frustrating. I mean, I hate, bringing that up. I'm just, that's frustrating to me.
the messaging when this all kicked off was, we're going to help get you the help you need. We're going to try to we're going to get to yes. And what you guys need, we're going to do all we can to help you get to yes. Well, it doesn't feel like that narrative or that started to slip, from day one. It felt great. And then it just started slipping. And then now it's to where, well, here's our engineering report specifically showing, but this little document over here. And here's the thing about it. This is what really ticks me off. That document in January, they had that document since January. And we were talking to them in January, February, March, 216 beds. And then it was over the summer, maybe June. It was over the summer, June or July. They asked our office, hey, that substantial damage estimate, we don't have that. We'd emailed it to them already. And they said, we don't have that in the portal. And then so our office said, well, we just forwarded the same email. I said, here's where we sent you in July. We're just going to resend the same exact thing to you that we sent you in July. Oh, thanks. And then 2 weeks later, you get nothing. And that just, to me, the fact that we had already sent that, they had that since January. And now it's like the one thing that could torpedo our case is the one thing they said, could you send that to us again? Or could you send, we can't find that.
Bureaucracy.
It's infuriating is what it is.
Yeah. I mean, and if you think about this, because to put it, if people wonder, because it's not about, the people in your community understand what I'm saying about like what you need and the things that are here and what that money is set up for. But someone sitting outside doesn't understand the implications sometimes of what we're talking about here. Because of that, they're endangering lives.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the longer the sheriff has to transport people back and forth, from one county to the next, or the longer that you don't have the proper infrastructure necessary to keep public safety at the forefront, the longer the risk. And it was because of a sentence or an email that, oh, well, I didn't get that email. And all the while we're talking about, paper pushers or, email junkies could literally affect someone's life. If you have somebody a dangerous person you're having to transport to court.
Like you said, it's not just about the money.
You get an officer hurt. You get people hurt.
It's a human rights and safety issues. It's not just about the money. And here's how crazy the discrepancy in the standard of evidence is. Let's say you have a blank wall in your facility. Blank wall, nothing there, just like a hallway maybe. And there's a crack that wide in the hallway, right? And you take a picture of that and say, hey, this is flood damage. They say, well, do you have a picture of that before the flood? How do we know that crack wasn't there? Well, it's a blank wall. Why would we take a picture of a blank wall? Who takes pictures of nothing? And if you don't have a picture of it, it's really going to be hard for us to say that that's flood related. That's the kind of craziness on one end that we have to satisfy. But in the other end, if it hurts us, they had some pre-existing stuff, not specific, just they did. And that blows the whole project.
The building itself shows you that the damage that came from the flood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's there. I've been here 25 years and been in that building for 25 years. And the building was not falling down. It wasn't cracking. There may have been some stress cracks over here and there, but these are massive cracks, interior, exterior.
Mm-hmm.
And
you see daylight through the walls.
The deal is that anybody that knows that facility, maybe they need to provide more education and more training to all counties in this country to explain to them, you got to do this or you got to do that and you got to have all this stuff. In my 25 years, I would never know to go around and take pictures of every corner in a building and put it in a file for one day that a hurricane may hit Cocke County. And they don't educate you. And then they're all up front, telling us, everything's good. Oh, this building's all to pieces. This building's tore all to pieces. It's all flood related. And then all of a sudden it's not.
Mm-hmm. And they'll tell you, this is terrible. And then they come back 2 weeks later and go, well, no, it's not. As if they never even spoke to you. That's like, that wasn't us,
Yeah, and that's.
But it's like this. Local facilities, we have to follow constitutional law. We have to follow civil rights, federal and state mandated laws for the jail. And they know the position we're in. So you really and truly in turn are civil rights violations comes from just not only, physical, comes from medical, comes from, how you house your inmates. That's civil. I mean, that's a federal, civil rights to classify.
1983 Civil Rights Action.
That's their rule.
Yeah, yeah.
But they're, we're in a position now to where, we're not doing anything to help you get to where you don't do that.
Yeah, and
that's the only thing that really bothers me is, everything's totaled, everything's done. We're giving you all this money, and then all of a sudden you disappear. And I mean, it's not a good look on FEMA. And
well,
it's not just here.
That's what I'm saying.
And it's not here. It's every county you talk to that's ever dealt with the same company, organization. Oh, it's all big and good, and then all of a sudden it becomes nothing. And I guess that's what infuriates us. And not only us, it infuriates the people in this county, because all of a sudden you're getting all this money to fund a project of the county's distress. And then you ain't going to give them a penny, after something that we could not control, nor could we help, to that extent. And then all of a sudden it's back in your lap. We're here for you. And then all of a sudden when it hits, FEMA, I mean, it's like, I guess my biggest thing is you force us. It's a FEMA forcing that you're going to hire this company. They're going to have to come in here and clean up the entire annex. They're going to have to do all this work, spend $1 million, and then we're going to reimburse you your $1 million and for a building that's condemned. Yeah. And I mean, you pay for money to a building, and I had people come up to me like, why are you cleaning something that's totaled? That's the rules.
It's pretzel logic.
That's FEMA rules.
Yeah. I mean, it makes no sense.
So, you spend all that money on something that you're going to have to tear down. I mean, that's wasted money to say you're going to spend $1 million to clean a building that you're going to have to tear down.
So how many people that is such a couple of these? I mean, these are great points. Like, how many people have ever asked your opinion on that relative to the powers that be with FEMA, or you've said this doesn't make any sense, or that's the rule? How many people have actually listened to you when you say those things?
Oh, I mean, if you just talk, not just talk about infrastructure, but talk to the people that lost their houses.
Yeah.
Right.
Talk to the people that lost everything they had worked for, everything they paid for. People had their house. Some people had houses paid off. Mm-hmm. And then you've got rules that tell you how you are going to do your property and how you're going to do this and how you're going to do that. If I'm paying for that land, I own that land, I pay for it, and then you can tell me how I have to do something.
Yeah, and it's not like local codes or state codes.
No, I went to one subdivision, whole subdivision total. I may got $1,000 check. If they had flood insurance, they may got a little more money. But coming from FEMA's rules and regulations, I had one lady and her husband, I mean, they lost it all. She apparently mailed her check back to them. So I don't need, it's like $1,200, $1,300, over $100,000 loss. And that's what gives the bad reputation and the bad name is we're all up front and good to go, and then all of a sudden you get I don't know, I can't say how I would feel. A house that my wife lived in for 10 years, sold in 18, demolished, 5-6 feet of water interior. And, we didn't have flood insurance when we lived there. Luckily the nice lady that bought her house did have flood insurance. But if you go back and you send me $1,000 check when I just lost $150,000 of my memories, my pictures and stuff, I mean, I can only imagine how.
Not to mention you have no place to live.
No place to live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're having to move in with people, live with people, hoping somebody's opening their door for you. But I mean, for them, I mean, I would be infuriated knowing that I just lost everything from a disaster. I followed all the guidelines, and then I still get $1,000 check. I mean, it's not a good.
That's a slap in the face.
And what and CJ makes a great point. It's not just the public infrastructure; it's the residents, it's the business, and business owners were told, "I'm sorry, FEMA doesn't cover businesses. You have to go to SBA and get a loan." And then our farmers, cattle growers, same thing. Some of them had 6-8 feet of silt on their property. Some of the property was just gone, because the river changed course. So. And it's the same way across all these. There's kind of 4 major areas. You got the public infrastructure, residential, business, and then you got the agricultural community. And across all four of those major areas, it's the same story over and over again.
Well, and that's the thing that, because all I can think about through what you all are telling me is how many resources were expended for the number of people who probably outnumbered the number of people you had responding.
Mm-hmm.
That how many hands that went through just for that no, or just to write that $1,000 check, or how many people they. I hope you understand what I'm saying.
I do. Yeah,
like it's this.
There was
this
more spent.
This ball of red tape. There was more spent on the administration of telling you no than probably just going, let's go forward with this. And long term with the fight and everything else, they could have, even if you lost the argument at the end, you still get more than you thought you could to do some of these things.
Well, they probably spent $200,000 to tell people no to $100,000 and to give them a $1,000 check.
But I mean, I'm going to say this. We've worked with some great FEMA representation.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, they're these.
Yeah,
these
it's
people,
not indicative. I would say
they come in here and they're very, and they tell you up front, this is going to go, this can't go, this can't go. But when you get told, yeah, this is going to go, this is going to be perfect, it's going to work out, and then all of a sudden it doesn't. I'm like, how does that go from yes and then all of a sudden no?
There are some really, we should make that point. There are some really good people that work with FEMA, but the system that we're all forced to work within is dysfunctional, does not work. We're talking about the extra $2 million. That's not FEMA reimbursable. We have to eat that $200 million. We do not get reimbursed for those extra expenses for transporting. And the new jail cost, I think we need to make sure we know put that out there. The estimate from 6 months ago for the new jail is over $70 million. So that's what, and I think that big.
Does that include the replacement of offices in the one court?
No, that's just jail.
Yeah, when they do a jail, you got to look at. I mean, they do that different. They base like one bed in a justice center setting. One bed's $250,000 per bunk.
And that's one of the things.
And that's a minimum. And
we deal with it all the time. And one thing I see is anywhere between $550 all the way up to $850 a square foot. To put that in perspective, that's more than it costs to build a hotel. Unless you're building a high rise downtown in, Knoxville or Nashville or Johnson City, you're talking about expensive construction. And if people don't understand why it's so expensive, well, that has to be the safest building in your community, because you're holding some of the most dangerous. Some who will be citizens who will walk out the next day, but there are a lot of dangerous people in that building, and also it's not like you can evacuate that building any chance you get, like you all had to do.
I'm glad you helped make that point. It's not $70 million. That's not a justice center, really. That's just to replace what was lost, and that's not counting the administrative side, like our office, the elections, veteran services, and all that other the UT extension, the agricultural. That's not replacing all that. That's just to replace the function of the jail, and I think Chancery may be included in that. Maybe.
Yeah. Administrative offices in one courtroom, and I don't know. It's kind of confusing how they do it, but it's like $250,000 per bunk.
Oh yeah, I mean that, and when you calculate all that, certain square footage costs less than others, but in general, the jail is the lion's share of by far of that cost, just because of the security of the facility, how things have to be built. It has to, one thing I hear all the time: we convert that school into a jail? Like, no, because schools you build schools in good shape, and even with modern day building them a little more secure, you're still only utilizing that facility 9 to 10 months out of the year, and not being used all day, and the people who are there generally want to be there. And where a jail, for every year of use ages about 3 to 4 years. So even with current standards,
jail's aging dog years,
right? Almost,
yeah.
But that's the reason they have to be built that way. Because if you built a jail more to like commercial standards, you'd have more escapes. Things would get torn up. Your maintenance bills, you'd be rebuilding jails all the time. But that's why some buildings last 30, 40, 50 years in jails, is because of the way you construct them, which drives that cost up. And that's pure. You guys know this, but that's purely educational for anyone who didn't
Well,
know
then there's
that.
the visibility. There's the safety part too. Is a classroom. People picture a jail. I always picture you got the long row of cells. They got the bars with the cells going down. But that's not what jails are anymore. You have to have eyes on, be able to see into every cell. One officer has to be able to see into all those cells. You have to have visibility on your inmates just for their own safety.
Well, there's a reason they don't put bars in jails anymore. We don't have to go into all that, but it's more closed, secure doors. It's security glass so things don't happen, is the best way I can put that. But if anything, I could say to all of that process is, I hope someone watches what we've been talking about today and does something, because I hope, I'm not trying to like blow a whistle or anything like that, because I know the state, I know we've really tried to help you guys, with a lot of those things. But it is disturbing to hear FEMA, but it's unfortunately, had a lot of family that dealt with FEMA during Hurricane Katrina, and some of them left and never came back because of that.
Well, you've got to, it's like everything else, in the perspective of mine, I got 110 employees, and, you got the administrative, you got all these different people that's in these positions. You don't know if something's broken when I can imagine, being the president or being the governor, or, you're over the whole state or over the whole United States of America. You have to depend on the people that are under you to find out where a problem may be. And the only way that gets addressed is by communication, and I'm sure and people see that. People know that. You can't fix everything. You cannot do it. If you got 110 employees and one or two's making mistakes or they're doing something they're not supposed to, you have to somehow figure that out. You can't just catch it.
Well, and that's
the same way with FEMA. Even going back as far as the Sevier County deal and other times that things have been used, there's a pattern, and you've got to figure out where that pattern's at to be able to fix that problem. And it's all about, be up front with what's going to happen, and don't give out misleading information to get you all built up and then drop you down, because that, and in my opinion, that's not good. So the people that's delivering the information, even from my office, if I'm delivering information, I better know exactly what I'm giving you before I give it to you. That way I don't have to come back and take it back. And that's with anything you do, not just FEMA, that's government, that's anything.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I'm talking about, related to, it's the old adage, well, that's the way we've always done it. And the fixes are just to add more, and versus scrapping things and going, let's get down to, for simplicity's sake. I guess I can equate it to this. It's a terrible analogy, but it to me, this works. It's like that toilet that you have to flush 3 or 4 times before finally everything goes, washes down. How many days or years are you going to do that? You could have bought 3 toilets in what you've spent in water, in effort, in time, when you could have just bought a new toilet, or, and bit the bullet on the front end, or realize it's not the toilet. Let me fix the mechanism that's causing this to not flow properly. Instead, it's, well, hold up, we got to examine the toilet, and that toilet's still usable because it does flush. But, and it's just like this, it's a toilet bowl. That's the best way I can describe it, when you could fix the problem. But all of these things that have compiled, it's like, oh, we need a department to oversee a department that's already a department, because we're trying to fix this mistake on the back end that's this department, instead of just scrapping it and going, hey, here is if A happens, then you go to B. If A happens but C happens, then you go to D. Yeah, to me that makes the most sense. And then you just, you streamline those things. Not saying it's not going to take any less effort, but it would sure be clear, especially for those who don't have finance departments, who don't have engineering departments, who don't have legal teams, and you have a rural distress county that supports everything what's good about America, in my opinion. And then when they need, their community needs the people who are supposed to render that aid in disaster or need them the most, it's just disappointing. Seeing that's not there, and they pay taxes like the rest of us.
You make a great point. It's the communities who need help the most, who have the fewest resources to be able to pursue these programs, right, are the ones who end up getting the least benefit. Because it goes back to not having the resources. But that's the whole reason why these agencies exist, is to provide the resources. But they make it so convoluted that, like Sheriff Ball and I both said, okay, you're telling me it's A or B, but you're saying it's A. Okay, great. Well, we're going to go with A. And then you get halfway down the road, and then they go, oh no, it's B. Well, you didn't say that. Like an example. We have a call with TEMA and FEMA. Been doing it since the floods hit on every Friday with all the mayors and the EMA directors of the affected counties. We were told at one point that when a decision comes from FEMA, it goes into everybody has a portal, and it goes into the portal, that decision letter. And they said, if you don't open that letter, the clock, your 60-day clock for appeal starts when that letter hit, when you open that letter, not when it hit your box, but when you open it and read it. Okay, so they can tell when you open it. And then 3 weeks later, we're told, oh no, forget that. Your clock starts as soon as it hits your portal, whether you read it or not. That was a change back from 2022. That was 3 years ago. And we're still being given 3 years old information. And I don't fault TEMA or the state for that. That's a FEMA issue, because FEMA is on that call.
Well, and that some people, and this is the thing that, because I look at resources, and if I reach out to TEMA, and I'm sure you've got, and I can't speak for you all, but if I need, something from TEMA and someone's dealing with something, man, Homeland Security for the state and TEMA are responsive.
Yeah.
They get right to you. They tell you exactly what's going to happen. There's no, that I know of, there's no garbage that they're feeding you. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. If it's not at least straightforward. There's none of this rigmarole. And some people are like, well, TEMA versus FEMA, that's two different size organizations. Honestly, to scale, they're dealing with less resources.
They are.
When it comes even to scale, as far as.
You're exactly. They don't have a blank checkbook like FEMA, right, normally does when they're spending on what they're supposed to spend.
But our state has actually done a good job of streamlining some of those processes.
TEMA, TDOT, TDEC, Economic Development, the Tennessee Department of Labor, all those state TCI, all these agencies have gone above and beyond what we could have. And the governor's administration themselves, just him and his commissioners, have gone above and beyond. They have been the best partners we could have. They have gotten us resources. We would not be afloat today if it was not for the help coming directly from the governor and his agencies. Right. It's 13 months out. We're not just talking about the jail. We've got several FEMA projects, like you're talking about the $1 million to clean up the court, just to clean up the courthouse, $1 million, and then there's also the bills for the records, the archives, preservation, and all that stuff. Well over $1 million. 13 months after the fact, we still have not seen a single dollar from FEMA. Not one. The state's been great.
Well, and I mean, I know some areas have, but I don't know if you guys. I follow this guy on a social media platform. He's up in the Asheville, North Carolina. His name Matt Van Swole. I don't know if you know who he is. If you get a chance, follow him. He kind of tracks all that stuff because he was in the affected area in North Carolina. It's kind of an interesting thing watching him and what the Amish have done in that community from other areas and built homes. Let's think about that for a second. And I do, and I want to bring that up because I just want us to think about that for a second. You have a community that doesn't have electricity, doesn't have communications, yet they're able to mobilize and build hundreds of homes before a federal government entity meant for disasters can even write a check. That's all I'm saying.
They were here days after.
The Amish were building temporary homes or even full homes for people, and they don't even have a landline phone.
The Amish community
that should tell you everything you need to know.
They've been here since the days after the flood, and they're still here helping our long-term recovery group to build the houses like what you're saying. They'll bring groups of 30 and 40 teams of 30 and 40 people down here and just get it done.
But I mean, that's the perspective I put it in. Now, people who have no modern amenities or no modern forms of communication are able to do that. And I'm sure you've experienced just with your community members, everybody doing that. But before you can even get a reimbursement for $1 for an agency, and I'm not trying to be anti-agency or anything like that. I work for the government,
right?
But to me, that's the essence of when your own community or when your own state or when people who don't have even just modern amenities to be able to get things quickly or do things quickly can build hundreds of houses and you're still getting through paperwork with FEMA. That's an issue. That's a big issue. I mean, and that's the mindset I want people to see. Is like that's really happening.
Well, to put a point on that, when the Amish first arrived, of course, they don't have phones. So when they showed up at the Emergency Operations Center a couple days after the flood, we went and met with them, and we were trying to tell them where the help's needed, and realized they pulled out a map. Okay, just show us where on the map, because they don't have there's no electronics. You can't cell phone, or you can't send them a pen or anything like that. So we just had to show them circle on the map. Okay, this area right here, this is the Denton community, and this is where they need a lot of help. So and they just they just loaded up and they went on down to Denton, but didn't even have cell phones, and yet look how effective they are. Just exactly to your point.
Yeah, and here we're talking about that the bureaucratic nonsense, and look, and I'm really not trying to throw them under the bus. All I'm saying is I see, and I've been, as it's related to the jail and trying to do things at lightning fast speed to, we're normally, if somebody's planning a new jail or we're doing something, there's a process involved to help counties along the way. And sure, we're ready to go. If somebody pulls the trigger, yeah, we can make things happen. This was unprecedented, but for the fact that you're that far out and you're still dealing with
don't have answers.
The red tape. It's almost like you want people to go, they want you to go away. And I hate that, because I think, when you have a servant's spirit, you serve. I mean, that's why we're all in this industry, every one of us, whether it's public safety, whether it's serving your community, it doesn't matter. It's what we're here to do, is serve people. But when you get caught up in the bureaucratic red tape of things, does that make you a public servant, or does that make you a bureaucrat? And that's what's so bothersome to me. And I'm glad to see that the federal government's rooting out a lot of that stuff. But still, before they get to that piece of it, you guys are having to kind of shoulder that load. And I hate seeing that. And oh God, I'm going to have to look. And I promise, please, I don't want to be in trouble, but it's the truth. I just want to see, what's right is right, and see your community, made whole with the jail, whatever, in all these public safety things that are going on. I would encourage people just to really take a look at what y'all are having to deal with, because even if it was minor, you'd still be dealing with some of that. Even if your jail wasn't destroyed, you'd still be dealing with some of those issues. And that's what, well, I know this started out as kind of to document what happened in Tennessee. Well, maybe we can document about what happened with processes and really, federal emergency management money, and maybe how that process should be helped. Because I'm not pointing my finger at anyone, but I am pointing a finger at the process, because if states can figure these things out, hopefully eventually they'll get to where the federal government can figure these things out and actually show a path for, when we're there, we can do this. And honestly, how much money that'll save in the long term? How many tax dollars if you go, all right, we see this happened, boom, let's get started on this. And then those dollars are taken care of.
Well, just and the ripple effects of that, if we could have had an answer, it's been, like I said, it's been over a year now. If we could have had an answer a year ago and knew exactly what to do, then we've pushed that timeline out by a year, which means it's an additional $2 million that we can't put towards recovery, that we have to put towards housing inmates and transporting them and all those additional costs. That 1 year of delay, every year of delay costs us $2 million.
Well, and I know what has to be frustrating is you guys have your community. I mean, you are the two most upfront people in your community, and they're going, "What's going on with this sheriff? What's going on with this mayor?" And you're not feeding them a line. I'm here to tell you that your community, you're not feeding them a line. I've watched it just with the jail and the courthouse piece. Watch what you all have gone through. I mean, it's kind of neat to get into a little more details today, but I'll say that it's got to be tough when you address your community, because when the wheels don't move and people are hurting in your community, or you're having to deal with things even as a local government, sometimes they wonder if you guys are doing what you need to do. And I see you all doing it every day. That's why we're sitting here, not only to document this, but now it's because your community needs to know that you're fighting for it. And you don't have, again, a team of lawyers, a team of engineers, you don't have that. And it's a shame that you all are having to deal with that level of bureaucracy. I hate it. And, I promise you from our end, we're going to continue to do, to help and moment's notice, whatever we need. I hope I've been that available. Our agency's been that available to you guys. And we'll continue to be. And I want to see what's right happen, because we need to do what's right because it's right. And not say we can't do because it's right because it's policy. And this one line on page 510 or 11 says, this says we can't do the right thing.
It can be interpreted to say that we can't.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's what's your next step? That's what I'm going to say. What's next for getting this problem solved with FEMA?
Well, for us, it's, again, we've hired consultants, which is kind of funny because it's all part of the game. FEMA, that's a reimbursable cost if we hire consultants. So we're hiring the consultants, and they're going to help us handle the appeal. And we've also, two-pronged solution, hopefully, is to get some funding from the state, via the governor's budget. Because if we're trying to get it into the governor's budget, because the legislative process, that gets a lot dicier, and the amounts, we need more money than the legislative process could probably provide. So we're trying to get it put into the governor's budget that he submits to the legislature, and then on one side, and then the rest of that would be winning the appeal with FEMA. If we can achieve success on both of those fronts, then it's doable for us. We have a path forward. If both of those fail, then I don't know what we're going to do. Actually, we've got to at that point probably $80 million, because everything keeps getting more expensive, and with no way to fund it. And that, again, that's just one piece of roughly $150 million worth of damages from the flood that we have to repair. So, when your total operating budget is $35 to $37 million a year.
For everything.
That's for everything. That's not counting schools. That's just running the county aside from schools. Trash, sheriff, everything, all that stuff, jail, all that. When it was $35 to $38 million total operating budget, and you've got to, on top of that, finance $150 million, and you're distressed, and your average fund balance is $200,000 to $300,000 of money left over at the end of each year. That's a hole too deep to climb out of on your own.
Yeah, it's not like you're blowing money.
No, we're being extremely frugal, extremely.
Yeah. Oh, I know that. I mean, trust me, I know. And that's the hard part for me, is that we have an agency with the federal government that's set up to handle that. And then the state can also help. And it's just, I want to see FEMA for once do what's right for not only Cocke County, but for all areas affected from Tennessee to North Carolina, and just make it square. If there needs to be a success story with them.
They need a win.
In the hit since Katrina, they need a win.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to hear where they had one. And I'm really not trying to be mean about it, but they need a success story, and this would be a perfect example of one.
Where they come through.
Yeah, where they actually come through, and I mean, of course, there's probably like minor success stories that certain communities where it's not this, because Hurricane Helene affected everything from, the tip of Florida all the way, into
Georgia,
Pennsylvania.
yeah.
There was something
Yeah.
there, so I understand the scope of that, but yeah, we're still having to fight the good fight, on your end, and I'm, the only thing I can be is sympathetic to that, because it's not an easy thing, and hopefully people will watch this and say, because that's one thing I want to ask you, if there's a question someone could have asked you, or there's something that no one's asked you or no one said to you, or you wish you could tell someone, or in hindsight, what would it be? Because that's sometimes you have 20-minute conversations here, you have an hour meeting here, and then you're like, I walk out of that meeting, I should have said this, or they didn't give me an opportunity to really lay out the whole story. If there's anything y'all could.
Well, I mean, it's just, you have to educate yourself on this stuff, especially when something this caliber happens. I mean, you got to go back and realize, am I doing this right? Is this right? Or, have a game plan for if it does happen again. That way you don't have the same obstacles that we've had to go through now. It's apparently that's out there, but it don't get relayed until something happens, and then it's too late at that point. So, I mean, everything's got to be done by their book, or if not, you're not going to get anything. It's pretty.
Yeah, it's
pretty
almost
strenuous, but
needs to be a good system set up with proper educating of, even if it's certain size government.
$100,000 house that you built back in 1970. Well, that $100,000 house going to cost you $500,000 today.
Yeah, and you get $1,100 check.
Yeah, I mean, it's the process is not good, and it's going to have to be fixed. It has to be.
And I'd say on my end, what question would I want people to ask is, I would say, would just to ask questions. Maybe don't jump to conclusions, or don't assume that you maybe know what's going on, or don't assume the worst. At least give us a chance to answer the questions. And if we don't know, we'll tell you we don't know. We don't have the answer, or this is what we're trying to do. But yeah, I would say a lot of times you don't know the questions people have until they ask them. So that would be my thing. Is just hey, instead of making assumptions or making accusations, let's ask questions and have a conversation.
It shouldn't be a situation where y'all feel like you're having to chase your tail, and then while you're chasing your tail, the other person's will never let you catch it. Does that make sense?
Shooting at you while you're trying to chase it.
Yeah. I got a lot of things I could say that, like terminology my grandfather did, but it's probably not appropriate. So
yeah.
Well, it's like we're trying to climb a mountain here, and we can all either work together and pull each other up, or we can just put rocks in the backpack and make it more difficult to climb. And the majority of people are there helping to pull each other up, but you got a few that, for one reason or another, and a lot of it's personal agendas, are trying to put rocks in everybody's backpack because they want to see it fail. Because if they do, then they can crow about it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, the old light dark speech, but transparency, and things come to light like this. And not saying that this, we're a little small agency in Tennessee, and y'all are a small rural county, but at least we could possibly have a platform and make enough noise to say, regardless of what happens, fix the process. Fix the ability for federal, if FEMA's putting money for federal disasters, let's get it into the hands appropriately. Sure, we don't want waste, fraud, and abuse, but this is visible. You can reach out and touch it, taste it, feel it, whatever. It's right there. It's obvious.
Well, you saw yesterday, just looking at the outside of the building.
And right after it happened, I remember driving around when you could, and it didn't look anything like that, like the separation, and like you said, to see light through it. And then eventually I do want to get in there and see, because I heard what's underneath.
I talking about the basement, amazing. How those walls are.
Yeah. So I may run up here pretty soon before Dietz gets done with the video, because he'll put it all together and edit the podcast. But maybe I could get some video footage, and we'll put that on there as well, because I think it's something people need to see.
And I'll send you the engineering reports, and they've got like the measures and all that stuff too.
Okay,
so
yeah.
They get actual pictures.
And I know there's some. Do you guys have compiled anywhere like the some of the news footage? I mean, I know I can probably go find it, but if anybody has it kind of compiled in one area, and just send me a link to where everything's compiled, because I watched the news and saw some of the videos. I just didn't know if you were keeping it somewhere archived.
I don't have any video.
I've got
still
some
pictures.
Still, yeah, I got some still pictures. What I thought might be really good is when they rescued Ben Hicks. If you have a shot of that, I don't know if I have that.
I think I seen that in the Plain Talk Wednesday.
Because I just want to provide some perspective, because somebody who lives, across the state while they heard something happened, or somebody who's from Tennessee who lives, somewhere else, they understand perspective and kind of what happened. Because while it was a major national disaster, a lot of focus got placed on different areas. I mean, because the
East
North
Tennessee
Carolina
was kind of left out. It was all Western North Carolina for the national coverage.
Yeah, and that's what most of the national coverage was on that. It wasn't on the affected areas in Tennessee.
Well, that's where all the candidates went. None of them came to East Tennessee.
So, but I mean, is there anything else that you guys would say or?
I just thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you and the whole governor's administration. Everyone, both inside the county, the residents, everybody who came from outside the county, all the volunteers from across the country, our surrounding region, cities and counties, the state, you personally for taking an interest, and thank you for being here, even 13 months out, for still taking the interest to come down here to set this up and to have this conversation. Can't thank you enough.
Well, it's I mean, it's one of those things that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, you got to deliver. I mean, you got to.
Yeah.
People don't know.
Yeah. And no matter what, true public servants, and I'm not saying that for myself, I'm saying that for everyone involved in our industry. If we're not reaching out and trying to make what's right is right, then are we truly public servants? And I know you guys are fighting that good fight every day, and I'll continue to do my piece, I promise. So, but thank you guys, and I look forward to getting a version of this, and maybe if we can come back another time and do an update or something like that. I think this.
Yeah, maybe we'll get that big update.
I think people might be very interested.
Big good news update. Hey, God bless you, man.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you,
Sheriff.
Oh, yeah.